Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, the author of The Accidental Guerrilla, David Kilcullen, discusses his new book, Counterinsurgency. The Johns Hopkins Security Studies professor is considered an expert in modern warfare and was an advisor to General David Petraeus in Iraq and to General Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan. He discusses the challenges of current U.S. military strategy with former Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
It's very good to meet you, Dr. Kilcullen, and I must say that I've been a fan of both your advice, as I've heard it from my military colleagues, and also of this book, Counterinsurgency, which is your latest effort, I believe. What I'd like to do in exploring this book with you is, in military parlance, kind of move from the tactical to the strategic to the grand strategic. And one of the things that struck me, because I've felt this way for a long time myself, being an infantryman for 31 years, you say it quite eloquently in your book, that we're killing our troops with kindness. Would you care to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the context that I write about it in the book, I'm talking about what we did in East Timor in the late 1990s, in what was basically a counterinsurgency for the first few months, but then we successfully smashed the insurgent group, the militias, and moved into a peace enforcement operation. I felt at the time that we really were loading down the infantrymen at the tactical level with this too much gear, too much reliance on fixed infrastructure, things like bottled water, heavy lighting equipment. The heaviest load for most guys in the field was batteries for all the electronics they were carrying, as well as ammunition and water. So I just felt, in that environment, you were taking on a guy who basically has a water bottle if he's lucky and an AK-47 pair of running shoes, and he can outrun you and outmaneuver you in the environment that we operate in. And almost always in East Timor, we would initially turn up too late and have to then maneuver to try and get the guy, because he's just faster than we are. And I think since then we've learned that you can dump a lot of that stuff and still operate. But I do think it's still a bit of a problem. Yeah.
I think it is for the American soldier and Marine too. I'm astonished sometimes at the loads that these guys and gals now increasingly have to carry.
Yeah.
You talked about your experience in Indonesia, and this is another place where I found your description of the incident at the bridge, the meeting engagement, so to speak, between the militia that wasn't supposed to be there, protected by the Indonesian main force and the Indonesian main force, and you suddenly coming upon each other with both of you having apparently bad maps, which is not an uncommon thing in territory that militaries aren't supposed to operate in the first place. And all of a sudden you have this firefight and people die and are wounded. And it's stunning the way your ability, and this is going to lead me to another question, to speak the language, to understand the culture on the other side, so to speak, and to diffuse this. The rapidity with which you did that under the circumstances, which were quite stressful. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was a fairly interesting day out, frankly. And there was a lot of ambiguity in that firefight, and it's reflective, I think, of a lot of the ambiguity that we live with now in the kinds of operations where we're working. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in a heavy firefight with Indonesian military, Indonesian police, and insurgents. The insurgents aren't even supposed to be there, and in fact, in the UN investigation of the incident, we all agreed to pretend that they weren't there. And to add to the ambiguity, at my own headquarters in Dili, the headquarters of the intervention force, there's an Indonesian liaison officer with a bunch of Indonesian guys and his own communication set sitting in the Tactical Operations Center listening to the firefight unfold. And kind of the weirdness of that for guys that are used to a straight binary conventional firefight is kind of disconcerting. It was also, it was kind of luck that not only were we, had I just come from being an advisor with the Indonesian military, so I had pretty close to native Indonesian skills, but also I actually knew some of the guys in the units that we were opposite that day, because I'd worked with the airborne troops and the special forces in Indonesia before that. And it's one of those, again, if you help anybody in a foreign internal defense environment, it's a pretty good chance you're going to be dealing with them on the other end of the firefight at some point later, and that's something that people tend to bear in mind. Yeah.
Another aspect of that intrigued me was, and you don't have to go into this too deeply if you don't want to, but it appeared to me that your wisdom in on the spot, as it were, in bringing your media team up too, and getting this perhaps even in Canberra, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, and everywhere else before your battalion or brigade knew anything about it, was instrumental in making this ultimately a successful event, but wasn't good for you with your leadership.
No, that's right. I mean, in fact, they weren't real happy about that. And in fact, the presence of combat camera is something that we've all got used to in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this was 10 years ago now, more than 10 years ago, and we weren't really into that mindset yet. It was kind of a wake-up call for me anyway. And we happened to have the media right behind us and an Army combat camera crew. And as we moved into the firefight, the media stepped back, but the combat camera came forward with us. So we had these Army camera guys filming through the firefight. And I actually started the firefight at the back of the formation, because I wasn't in command of the overall formation. And I had to fight my way through the firefight to the front, a couple of hundred meters with my radio operator. Right. By the time I get to the front of the engagement, I turn around and there's the combat camera guy right behind me. He's followed me all the way through the firefight. I was like, dude, I'm surprised to see you're still alive, carrying that big camera. When we moved forward to negotiate with the Indonesians, I made the snap judgment that, well, the guy made it all the way through the firefight. He should really come forward as well. And I'm pretty sure that saved us at one point. We came over this small stone bridge across the river, turned a slight corner, and there was an Indonesian light machine gun crew struggling with their machine gun, which had jammed, and they were about to open up, and then they saw the camera crew, and they were like, better not. And I think they realized this is going to be on the international media. I also was in a position of having to conduct a negotiation with, so CNN and everybody else stepped up to the location as soon as the firefight was over, and I knew that the negotiations were going to be captured on international media, and for some bizarre reason, the Indonesians were perfectly willing to admit that they opened fire first, while we were still on our side of the frontier, which I knew was
two good things to have happen.
Right, and it was an admission that they were probably going to change as the incident developed. So I had them say that on camera in front of everybody else early in the negotiation, which kind of saved our ass when the investigation came down from the United Nations. But yeah, it wasn't a popular move with particularly my battalion commander. The force commander, General Cosgrove, was a genius with respect to this kind of stuff, and he got it immediately. So I had top cover from the highest, like divisional commander level, right. But I had a couple of people in between me and him that weren't real happy.
Right. Take that a little bit further, if you would. I hear from my Marine and soldier contacts in both Iraq and Afghanistan that the junior officers understand, generally speaking.
Yeah.
That the senior officers don't, that they're still stuck in the Cold War, and so forth and so on, and that the leadership disconnect there is quite frustrating for junior officers.
I would qualify that a little bit by saying some senior officers really do understand.
Yeah.
Guys like
obviously Petraeus.
Yeah, Petraeus, yeah. But guys like H.R. McMaster, Chris Cavoli, those guys who have done this for a very long time, right. But I do think that all of us, not just the U.S. military, but all militaries have this tendency of, you get far enough into the conflict, you think everybody needs to have a turn. Otherwise, they're going to miss out on the opportunity to participate. And in Vietnam, that led us to cycle people through, I think, a little bit too quickly in command positions.
Yes.
In Afghanistan and Iraq, it has led to the occasional guy popping up who hasn't been there before and doesn't get it in the same way as, say, his junior officers do. But I generally find people learn quickly. And there's always a bit of a disconnect between the tactical level and the operational level in terms of how people see the conflict. Nowhere clearer than on the rules of engagement issue in Afghanistan. So I think, but that doesn't necessarily mean the senior guys don't get it. It means they're dealing with a different set of pressures than the guys tactically. And there's always that tension. You know yourself as an infantryman, the patrol commander and the forward scout have different interests, right? The patrol commander wants to move quickly to contact. The forward scout doesn't want to get shot, and so there's always this tension between who's walking too fast, and it's like that at a higher level as well.
I don't know if you've read the book Matterhorn. I just finished reading it.
I have not, actually.
It's sort of like the red badge of courage of the Vietnam conflict. I couldn't put it down, and it's 700-800 pages.
Wow.
Marine wrote it.
Okay.
Maybe 30 years, I think he says in the preface, in the writing. But it's a vivid description of combat in the jungle.